You think being alone in the woods is peaceful? Think again. 3 people I know walked into trees expecting quiet and came back carrying something else, questions, scars, a kind of caution that never quite leaves. These are first-hand accounts, surveyors, guides, and a kid who trusted the wrong person. If you like real wilderness horror, hit subscribe. There are more stories like these. 1. The Surveyor, Idaho. I made a living walking lines other people drew on maps. Freelance land surveyor, boots pack, the smell of cold metal tape on a morning when the frost still clings to the grass. I liked being alone. You learn to listen to the land, which way the wind comes, how far a ridge will carry your voice. I filed my route with the ranger station before I left that week. Coordinates, estimated return, the one precaution every solo winter worker repeats until it sounds rote. The contract was a couple days out in the Clearwater region, pockets of public timber and private corners that meet in legal knots. I camped light, a one-man tent, a small stove, a couple of extra batteries. The first day of field work went clean, lines pinned, small cairns set, until the day turned and the ground betrayed me. I slipped on an icy shelf. My ankle twisted in a way you only feel deep inside your body, that sharp, private alarm that tells you something's broken. I stayed where I was for a long, slow minute, breathing hard, listening. The trees were doing the work they always do in winter, muffling and deadening. The snow took the edges off sound. I tested weight, rolled my ankle, cursed softly. No snap, but every step sent a flare of pain through the joint. The rational part of me knew I should radio in and wait for the ranger crew, but the job was due, and the nearest phone was hours away by foot. I decided to hobble back to my tent, to pack up, to drive out and get a medical look. The choice was practical. It felt like responsibility. It would later feel like the first of a series of bad calculations. My pack got lighter on one side as I redistributed weight to take pressure off the ankle. I left several of the temporary markers where they sat, compromised but salvageable. The tracks I made while heading back were clumsy, deep, an irregular Morse code in the white. I hunched forward, breath short in the cold. At first the forest offered only its usual sounds, a drip of thaw, the whisper of my jacket, the distant wind. Then, faint and soft as a toe against a tent, I heard another set of steps. I stopped. The air around me seemed to shrink. Out here you hear everything and nothing, and it's hard to judge distance. The steps weren't mine. They were deliberate, measured, someone matching cadence to my own. For a moment I thought it might be a ranger. For a moment I imagined a hunter with a rifle. But it wasn't anyone I expected. I turned once, twice, trying to catch the prints. There were other boot marks in the snow, older, crusted with ice, circling the route I had taken earlier in the day. They were larger than mine, and they didn't follow the same trail. I stepped back and found that for every awkward shuffle I made, there was a mirror step a little to my left or right. Whoever it was had the patience to track the same line. The hair along my neck tightened. The sound came next. A metallic clink, like someone tapping a carabiner against a tree limb. It was small, but through the hush of the woods, it cut right into my head. Again and again, a little ringing clang from somewhere exactly at the edge of hearing. I crouched, listening, chest tight. The clink stopped when I held my breath, started again the second I exhaled. It was a sound without context, and that made it worse. No voice, no human orientation, just deliberate noise like someone playing at the boundary of my nerves. I quickened my pace, not because my ankle allowed it, but because the mind wanted to outrun whatever curiosity was following. Every step creaked in the snow. I tried to count the gaps between those metal taps, to make them into a pattern I could predict, a rhythm I could match and thus track. Patterns feel safer. You're allowed to be scared of a thing you can name. By the time I could see the pale wedge of my tent through the trees, the sounds had shifted. Branches seemed to snap a little closer, and once, just once, I heard a soft scrape like cloth being drawn along the snow. My tent was where I'd left it, the guy lines taut under a rim of frost. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if I couldn't see the person now, maybe they weren't there at all. Maybe it was a deer or a hunter who'd turned back. My head supplied possibilities to keep from leaping to worst ones. I made a show of unlocking the tent flap slowly. If someone was out there, I wanted them to think I was calm. Inside, I fumbled with the stove, warmed my hands, prayed the satellite phone would show enough signal to ping the ranger's office. The phone had a bar, one bar, and it gave my location with a sluggishest sort of honesty. I yanked out the sleeping bag and forced myself to sit, rubbing the ankle while the pain pulsed like a second heartbeat. Then the footsteps circled. It started as the softest of scuffs, a movement in the snow that skimmed around my tent. I heard the fresh, compacted crunch of boots going clockwise, slow and careful, pausing opposite the vestibule before moving on. The hair on my arms stood up, as if to salute a uniformed intruder. You don't want anyone near your tent unannounced in the backcountry. People are dangerous in ways wolves aren't. People plan. I did the only stupidly human thing available. I whispered, "Hey." It came out small, fragile. The circling stopped. I felt my pulse in my mouth. An old speech of safety, sometimes told in wilderness classes, came back to me. Make noise. Let people know you're there. Don't open until you have a clear idea who there. I unzipped the flap a crack and peered out, keeping my boot inside so I could close it if necessary. There, at the shadowed tree line, maybe 20 yards away, stood an old man. He didn't make another sound. I could see his shoulders hunched, the way sweat or cold can make a person wrap themselves inward. He was small and thin, the sort of man the wind could have carved a fingertip off of. His clothes looked worn and stained, the kind of odorless grey that winter gives to fabric. His face was a map of tight lines. The cheekbones were sharp under skin that looked thin as onion paper. He watched me the way someone watches a television show they can't look away from. He didn't come closer. He didn't raise a hand. All he did was hold his gaze, and in that hold I felt something like a judgment I hadn't earned. Then, low and clear as a fallen branch, he spoke. "You're a lucky man." Those 3 words hung between the trees like a question. Lucky? Lucky for what? Lucky because I made it back to my tent? Lucky because I didn't bring a gun? Lucky because he decided not to strike? I wanted to ask, to demand a meaning, but the sentence had no follow. He turned and stepped back into the woods, his movement small and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Within seconds the dark folded around him, and he was gone, as if the trees had simply exhaled him out. I sat on a little foam pad, with my hands braced on the tent fabric, until the sun went lower and the cold became a physical presence requiring negotiation. When I finally saw the headlights of a truck some hours later, a ranger checking the routes, they had the cheerful, almost incredulous look of people who do this for the love of being useful. I told them everything. I could feel the story unspooling from me. The ankle, the boot prints, the metallic sound, the circling. They took notes. They asked the right professional questions. They told me to file a formal report and to avoid solo winter jobs if the ankle wasn't right. Weeks later, after x-rays and a boot that made a limp feel respectable, I sent in my report. They logged it and said they'd look for signs, tracks, theft, a trespasser known to the area. They never called back with more than the bureaucratic hum of a well-meaning office. I stopped taking solo winter work after that. I'd never had a real reason to be paranoid before that night. Afterwards, paranoia had the weight of evidence. I replayed that man's words until the syllables began to mean whatever my fear wanted them to mean. Lucky for what? Lucky because he'd only talked. Lucky because I happened to be behind a tent and not on the trail. Lucky because whoever he was chose not to do anything worse. People gave me suggestions, of course. Maybe he was a local who'd been watching the lines, maybe a hunter, maybe a derelict who lived off the edge of the road and drifted like a ghost. There are 3 easy explanations I turn over when I let myself think of him. Human curiosity that turned dark but contained, a harmless man who'd come to warn me about loose property, or an intentional predator who walked those woods waiting for someone to be alone. I don't know which it was. The only thing I do know is how the woods changed me. I learned to file every route, to travel with company, to think twice before taking my tent out on a winter night. I learned that the most dangerous thing out there isn't always the weather. Sometimes it's the person who knows how to be part of the background. If that felt like a close call, the next one will make you never want to go snowmobiling alone. 2. The Cabin and the Scream, Alaska. I grew up with a map of the state folded into my head. You can tell an Alaskan by the way they measure distance, not by miles but by hours, by stew recipes, by the number of trees between the road and shelter. I guided winter trips for a living, took people into that white vastness to teach them how to respect it, how to move through it without pretending we owned it. That confidence helps when things go wrong. It doesn't make you immune. Randy was my boyfriend then. He was a good man in the practical, stubborn manner that works in cold places, solid, willing to get his hands dirty. The trip that turned sideways was supposed to be routine, a run between cabins, to move supplies and check on the property. We had 2 snowmobiles, satellite emergency beacons, and the blue competence that comes from hundreds of similar trips. We checked the machines, tightened the straps, and ate a quick lunch of coffee and granola. The snow had that kind of heavy, glassy look that says it's holding together for now. We'd been together on machines for years. We joked about how the valley would miss him when he retired from laughing at my jokes. 2 minutes later, his sled was on top of him. It wasn't dramatic in any filmic way. I watched his snowmobile tip and the belt, one of those small mechanical betrayals, caught the machine and dragged it over his leg. He was pinned. His face was a tight white oval. I tried to pry the machine free, but it was heavy and angled wrong, and the air in his lungs was already carrying a coldness that told me the clock was moving. He had a compound injury to his leg, bent in a way legs aren't meant to, blood already darkening the snow. Hypothermia isn't loud at first. It's a quiet erasure. He was desperate, whispering and trying to make jokes to keep the edges of his mind from slipping. I made the decision that still splits me every time I say it aloud. We had a standard protocol for injuries. Stabilize, get shelter, contact emergency services if possible. I couldn't fix what was broken in the field. I couldn't drag a snowmobile and a man at once. So I did the only thing that felt viable, maybe the only responsible thing. I covered him with a reflective blanket, wedged him against a tree, tried to splint the leg with a forearm and a pack strap, and told him I was going for help. He squeezed my hand and told me not to be a hero. He laughed in a small, pained way. I left a marker near his head, a GPS ping so someone could find him, and rode out hard toward the last known cabin where we'd left a spare radio. I told myself I'd be back within an hour with a machine big enough to pull both sled and man out. The sky closed in. A whiteout came on the tail of a wind shift. It's a trick of winter. The landscape loses its edges, and any landmark you took for granted vanishes. The compass becomes your friend. The landscape becomes a grey that swallows distance. I kept my bearings, dialed the GPS, followed the waypoints. On paper, it was straightforward. In practice, whiteout is a kind of social betrayal. Everything you trained your body to do becomes worthless because sight is a memory, not a tool. I saw smoke through the trees like a promise. For a while, smoke is the most welcome thing in a wasteland. It means warmth, people, shelter. Simple things in a place that gives few of them. I angled toward it, thinking of the stove that would dry Randy's gloves and that someone might have a radio. The first building I found was small, maybe a hunting cabin, and it had a light through the window. The door was ajar. I remember stepping onto the threshold and feeling my knees loosen. The interior smelled of wood smoke and something old, like a house that has been shut for a long time and then aired. There were bowls on a shelf, a kettle warming on a small cast-iron stove. A coffee mug sat where someone had left it, as if they'd stepped away for a moment and never come back. Binoculars lay on a table with a smear across one lens. A map on the wall had routes circled in a slow, obsessive hand. A notebook lay open on the table, pages filled with names and dates, numbers and times, coordinates alongside short notes, saw tracks here, left markers, last seen. The handwriting was small and cramped, the kind people use when they're trying to make sense of a long list of things they can't stop thinking about. I felt better at first. Relief is a small, treacherous emotion in the woods. My fingers shook as I drank the hot coffee the stove had provided. There was dryness and welfare in heat, and I thought, briefly and selfishly, how stupid it would be if this cabin belonged to another guide who could help with a sled. I propped my elbows on the table and read the notebook. The entries were methodical, like shore patrol notes. Some of the pages were catalogues of people. Names, times, a peculiar shorthand I couldn't make sense of. A few entries were circled. A map had been annotated with routes and small X's, the circles so tight they left impressions on the paper below. It suggested someone had been keeping track of movement through the valley. There was more in that cabin than a desperate searcher would leave. A small pile of matches, extra blankets, rope, a radio with no battery. The binoculars were scuffed, the map marked as if someone had been anticipating travel. It all looked lived in, not staging. My head started to churn with the possible explanations I know now, and knew in that moment in a much rougher way. Somebody had been here keeping an eye on people, someone had set up a shelter to help, or someone had used this place to watch and to plan. I found a page with a name I recognized, just a first name, no last name, a single entry with a time. It was the sort of thing guides mark. People seen on a particular day, vehicles noted. My stomach flipped. There were gaps in the log, as if whoever kept it had stopped and started again. The handwriting changed slightly, as if whoever wrote it had rushed at certain times. There was, tucked under the notebook, a photograph folded in half, taken outdoors, trees all around. A dark figure at the edge of the frame. I didn't open it then. I didn't want to find faces to pin to the unease. I left my engine running outside and returned for a sat phone battery and extra rope. I told myself I would be decisive, get help, and be back for Randy. The snowmobile coughed and roared as I mounted, a small, frantic animal. The cab of the world had shifted again, and the map I'd carried in my mind was no longer useful. I pulled the throttle, let my eyes blur for a second against the wind, and headed toward the waypoint I had in my head. As I was shutting the door, I heard it. It didn't come from above like an animal. It came from beneath my feet, from the floor, from a place where a person or a thing could be hidden. It was a sound you remember, not because it's loud, but because it doesn't belong. A scream. A voice cut so raw that it felt like someone had split their throat to make it. Not a cry of pain that you can process, but a higher, thinner noise that threaded straight into the marrow of me. I froze. Boot on the doorframe, engine idling, every survival instinct reconfiguring. The scream wasn't long. It was one single animal note that finished and decayed into that special silence snow makes when you take a breath beneath its weight. For a second, the world outside and the world inside the cabin were the same thing. The scream had bridged the two. For a second, I thought it could have been anything. A trapped animal, someone who had been hurt beneath the floorboards, a recording, a prank, a hallucination from the white cold. My first reaction was to go back inside, to look under the floor to find out if it was Randy or someone else in immediate danger. A rational voice in me said that I'd been trained to check shelter and that an injured person needed time and treatment. And another voice, the quieter one that speaks when you are most honest, said that the scream had been so wrong that maybe running towards it would place me right into something I couldn't undo. I did the practical thing. I pulled the map back down, checked coordinates, compared the annotated circles to the direction of the road I knew. The map didn't make the scream less real. The notebook was still open to the page with names. In the margin, someone had scribbled shorthand that could have been a note about a person under the floor. It was the kind of handwriting that gets messy when the writer is anxious. But it might have just been a grocery list. It might have been nothing. My head spun with scenarios. Someone using a hidden space beneath the cabin to keep a person. A trap set to bring travelers into the house. An actual family member who lived there and had a medical emergency. Or something less tidy. A hallucination produced by sleep deprivation and cold compression, my mind making a fear into a sound. Standing there with my hand on the doorknob, I understood that any decision had moral gravity. If I had ignored the scream and left, a person might have been in danger. If I went in, I might walk into an ambush or a scene I couldn't handle alone. The rational step was to call for help on the radio. The radio had a dead battery. The sat phone had one bar, but I had left it in my sled, with the engine running. I made a choice that I justified in the same way the surveyor justified his hobbling out. I would go to Randy, make sure he wasn't freezing under a piece of plastic, and then return with equipment. In my head, it was a loop, quick and reliable. I slapped the sled into gear and rode away. The scream still a bruise in my ears like something stuck there. The snow rose behind me in a white plume. I thought about Randy, about the way an injury cradles a person's scent. I thought about leaving someone alone, and about the way you can be certain of everything, then suddenly know nothing. The cabin sank behind me until it was a pinprick on the horizon, then a smudge, then gone. I found Randy where I'd left him. He was colder, blood stiffened black at the edges of his pant leg. He was conscious and coherent enough to curse me for making him wait, which is a strange and human epitaph. It means the person is still in there and angry. We patched what we could, the pack straps and a splint made from a sled pole and tape, the sorts of field fixes, you know, if you live through winters and have seen enough bones to know where they don't belong. He was talkative in the way shock sometimes keeps people talking, telling me jokes and complaints in a litany to distract his mind from the pain. We loaded him on the sled, enough to get him to the nearest real cabin with a radio. On the way back, the sky had leaned toward the late grey of afternoon, and something in the light made the world thin. We rode back toward where I'd seen the smoke, expecting the cabin like a lighthouse. The trees gave up their silhouettes a little at a time until there was nothing at all where the cabin had been. No path, no smoke, no scuffed snow, just trees and heaps of new powder that could have covered any sign. I slowed until my fingers went numb in the grips. The imprint of tires and the ring of a door had been there and then gone. Randy asked me what I was staring at, and I said nothing, which meant everything. I braked hard, brought him down to the ground, and we searched every footprint, every hollowed place between roots. The only things left were the shapes the sky made through the branches, the way the world kept to what it was willing to show you. I remember thinking about the photograph folded in a notebook I had seen, a dark figure at the edge of the frame, and the way the corners of the cabin's door had looked like someone had left them open on purpose. We dragged Randy to the nearest radio point with a generator and sent out the call for a medevac. The helicopter that lifted him away looked like a miracle, rotors chewing at a white landscape, hoist cables slicing air. People who haven't been in one don't realize the odd intimacy of being lifted like that, suspended between weight and sky, while others move below in a choreography meant to keep you alive. He survived. He was lucky in the raw, willing way I had been taught to measure luck with numbers and breaths. But what startled me wasn't the helicopter or the rescue or the medics. It was the way the cabin folded into the landscape as if it had never been there. Back at the ranger station, I tried to describe the cabin, the stove, the notebook, the map with circles, the photograph. Rangers nodded and took notes. They asked the measured questions rescue services always ask. Did you write down coordinates? Did you make a formal report? Can you show us the map? I told them yes, and then the thinness of the whole thing got worse. Because I hadn't taken photographs in the moment. The stupid human oversight of someone who assumed the world would hold fast to the memory like a photograph. There was only my word and a handful of small items we'd brought back on a clipboard. Later, the official answer was gentle and meant to close my panic. Sometimes in whiteout you see things. The mind manufactures shelter where there is none, stress and cold cobble together images that never were. They suggested I could have mistaken another cluster of trees for a building. They said a lot of bureaucratic things meant to soothe. They didn't say there was a notebook with names. They didn't say who had made the circles on the map. And they didn't say why. Amid all the things that can happen in the wilderness, some people set up places that look like refuge but are anything but. There are 3 ways I try to sort the memory of that cabin when it wakes me at 2 in the morning. One is that I hallucinated a shelter in the fog of fear, a dream stitched into the snow to help me believe there would be help. The second is that the cabin existed, an actual human refuge occupied by someone who might have left someone in the underfloor space intentionally or by accident. The third is darker, that the cabin was a trap maintained by someone who watches travel corridors and waits for the right moment to use the wilderness against a traveler. All 3 explanations are possible, and none is satisfying. Each one leaves me with the same question. What do you do when your training tells you to trust the patterns of the land, and the land itself can be used against you by another person? I told myself I would never travel alone again in conditions like that. I told myself 100 safety rules, and then, the next winter, I still found the road and the sled and the gear. The voice that said we were lucky had a different tone now, a tone threaded with the idea that luck is not just an absence of bad outcomes, but a thing you earn or lose by tiny decisions. The cabin sits like a bruise in my memory, warm and full of the ordinary objects of hospitality, and at the same time threaded through with an unease so precise I can't ignore it. I should have stopped there in the story, with the hoist and the medics and the slow bureaucratic unravelling, but there are details that change the weight of what happened. A name in a notebook that later showed up in a way that made no sense, a circle on a map matching a route I'd always known, the photograph folded like a thing meant to be hidden. My mouth can still taste the stale coffee from that cabin, and sometimes when the wind slips just right, I hear a noise that could be a scream or could be the wind playing at an old house's eaves. There are worse things to find in a forest than a trap, worse because they're clearer, but there is nothing that unsettles you the way the unknown does, particularly when the unknown seems to be arranged by another human being who has the patience to wait and the cruelty to plan. If what I told you so far makes the hair on your arms bristle, wait until you hear the last one. This next story is about someone who wasn't a stranger at all, but someone who gave you their trust, someone who smiled at you, the way someone who knows a secret smiles. It begins as high school does, with a crush. The rest of it is more complicated than that. It begins as high school does, with a crush that feels like a private weather pattern. Sienna rolled into my life the way a rumor does, quiet at first, then suddenly everything you think you know about a room rearranged around her. She wasn't flashy. That was part of why she stuck in my head. She had these pale, flat smiles that looked practiced, and a way of tilting her head so you felt like she was considering the version of you she wanted to keep. She wore a green army jacket even in May, and always smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's cigarette smoke. I thought she noticed me the way someone notices a bookmark. Useful, present, quietly there. We weren't close at first. She sat in the back of English and doodled maps along the margins of her composition book, little trails, contour lines, arrows. Once I pointed that out and she shrugged like it had no meaning at all, then handed me the corner of her sketch. "I go hiking sometimes," she said, "not with kids who think backpacks are fashion accessories." A month later she texted me, "Hike Saturday, you in?" She sent a time and the name of a trail I vaguely knew from late afternoons with a friend, a place where the high school kids smoked and dared each other to run to the old lookout. Her message had that casualness people use when they're testing a rope to see if it holds. I said yes because I wanted to see her laugh close up, and because saying yes felt easier than saying no to the possibility of being noticed. I told myself we'd be a group. Sienna framed it like that at first, just a few of us. But groups in high school have a way of becoming whittled down. The day arrived, and only 3 of us met at the lot. Me, Sienna, and a kid named Jace, who smelled like motor oil and wore a beanie too small for his head. The sky was the kind of temperamental mid-September blue that makes you think the weather is showing off. The trailhead was half a mile from the parking lot, a ribbon of dirt amid maples that were just starting to color. Sienna walked with that slow, contained stride. She pointed out a rock with a face in it and told us to look for cairns. We joked. We fell into old rhythms. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the loose cheer of small talk. I let my guard down. Of all the stupid things in that afternoon, that felt like the worst. Assuming normal meant safe. The trail forked beyond a stand of birch. There were 3 signs nailed to a post, one pointing toward the lookout, one toward the creek bend, and one toward a lesser-used spur that hugged an old logging road. Sienna stopped and looked at the signs for a long, impressive beat, like a person tasting a menu. "Let's go left," she said. "The view is different there." Her voice had that suggestion-turned decision quality, the little nudge that makes your choice feel like your own. I didn't hesitate. Jace shrugged and followed. We went left. At first the path narrowed in the way it always does when the world begins to close in at the edges. The sunlight sifted through the leaves in a pattern of brief applause, and the air smelled rich with wet earth. We picked up the path as it wound, single file, branches brushing shoulders, the kind of trail that makes your peripheral startle when a squirrel shoots off. I kept pace with Sienna because I could. She was never more than a body length ahead, steps light and steady. I tried stupidly to memorize the curve of her neck, because I thought I might later need to reconstruct how I had felt at that exact second. Then the path turned into a narrowing cut that had the feel of someone consciously pruning the world. It got skinnier where the trees leaned in, and the ground sloped down toward a small ravine. Sienna stopped and turned to me with a look that had the small, private warmth of someone offering a secret. "You go first," she said. "I'll be right behind you." It was a small permission, the kind everyone asks for in thrill-seeking. "Go ahead and I'll be behind you." I took it as a compliment and a challenge. I stepped forward. At some point between the leaning trees and a clump of moss, I lost sight of Sienna. One moment she was a shoulder, a slight sway. The next she was gone, absorbed by the light, like a photo being developed in reverse. I slowed, thinking she had paused to examine something, pressed a hand on a trunk to steady myself, then called her name. "Sienna." My voice sounded like I was speaking over a long table. No reply. I rounded a stand of ferns and saw movement at the edge of my sight. A flash of denim, the suggestion of someone crouched. I straightened, heart doing that peculiar staccato it does when you catch sight of something that couldn't possibly be what it appears to be. A man had been sitting on a log, leaned forward like he was tying a boot, and when he saw me, he froze. That split second held everything. Then another man stepped out from behind a tree to my left and blocked my path. He was broader, solid in the way men who work with their hands become solid, broad shoulders, calloused hands. He didn't shout. He didn't ask for money. He moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed what to do next. The first man, a thin one, his beanie pulled low, stared at me like he was trying to figure what I might sell. The second reached for me before I could think. My feet tangled in roots. I felt like an animal made awkward by a moment of forgetting how to be human. He grabbed my ankle hard and hauled me back. The world narrowed to the feel of fingers in my jeans, the smell of damp earth, the sudden metallic taste in my mouth when I bit my lip. I remember thinking, in that odd bifurcation the brain produces under stress, that if someone had told a story like this to me a month earlier, I'd have said it sounded cinematic. Actors, set up, a chase that ends in a cool getaway. The reality is clumsy and small and painfully tactile. I twisted, tried to yank free, and with the motion my mouth crashed into a root. Blood welled in my lip, thin, iron-edged. That sound, the harsh little pop of blood, felt like the closest thing to proof I might ever get that it was real. They pushed me, shoving me sideways toward a slope of brambles that scraped at my calves and tore thread from my jeans. I swung my arms, grabbed at air. A strange, sharp clarity came with the panic. Don't look at faces. Don't try to read reasons. Do whatever you have to do to put distance between you and them. I remember a single impulsive thought. Run downhill because gravity helps. I tucked my chin and dropped like falling into cold water. Branches whipped my face. My palms tore on the dirt. The thin man lunged at me again but misjudged his reach, and I slipped through the gap between them like a needle through fabric. One of them cursed a guttural sound, and the other gave chase. I sprinted with the peculiar, pumped-arm high breath of someone whose lungs are making a loud, urgent complaint. My lungs burned with the double heat of exertion and panic. Each footfall felt like a conversation with the forest. My sneakers spoke in slaps against the trail, and the hum of blood in my ears was deafening. I don't know how far I ran. Distances warp when you're being hunted. Quickly, though, the world offered a new problem, the parking lot. The horror of that moment is the way it made us both hunters and prey shift shape. If I could make it to the lot, to cars and the potential of other people, my odds improved. If I couldn't, they caught me in the gnarled throat of those trees. I saw a flash of metal through the brush, the nearest row of cars. Relief makes you clumsy, though. I misjudged a route and twisted my ankle hard, a stab of pain that is sharp without being pretty. It was an old high school sprain come back to bite me in an instant. My breath came hot and thin. I heard someone behind me, the crunch of leaves faster, and a hand grabbed at the shoulder of my jacket. I turned and elbowed backward without thinking. My elbow connected with something soft and surprised. The guy I hit staggered, cursing, and that gave me the half-second I needed to scramble into the light of the parking area. Cars were scattered, a few teenagers leaning on the hoods of their parents' SUVs, a couple packing up coolers. People looked up, faces suddenly sharp. I shouted help, not the cinematic, world-shattering shout you imagine when trapped, but the human one that is ragged and hoarse. The two of them didn't make it into the lot. They reached the edge and then hung back, like hunters who had hit a line of light they weren't prepared to cross. One of them called something I couldn't hear. The words were swallowed by the open air. They melted back into the trees the way shadows do, like they were part of the plan to be seen, and then unseen. I walked or stumbled toward Sienna's car. It was there in the lot, a dark little hatchback where we'd left it, the same dent near the rear bumper she'd always said she hadn't noticed. She was leaning against the trunk, scrolling a phone, face blank in that student way, cool, composed, a wall of not saying. For a moment I just stood in the spill of light and used up the last of my breath watching her. Her hair was tucked behind one ear. She looked at me like someone glancing up at a TV when a commercial interrupts. "Sienna," I said, voice thinner than I meant it to be. "What?" She took in my state like a fact she might consider later. "Whoa," she said. "Dude, what happened to your face?" My hand came up to my mouth and tasted blood. My ankle throbbed. I wanted to tell her to call the cops or to ask her where she'd been, but the things you want to say when you are wounded get tangled with the things you have no proof for. "You were behind me," I said finally, because I had to say something that landed somewhere between accusation and question. "For you told me to go ahead." She blinked. There was a minute jag of something, an almost smile that could have been amusement, contempt, or pure indifference. "I told you to go ahead because you said you wanted to see the view," she said. Her tone was conversational, as if we were discussing a movie we didn't much like. "I left to check the map. I thought you were right behind me." You can tell a lie by how the details cushion it. Her shrug had been a small practice thing. The way she avoided looking at my ankle the first time she answered made my skin prickle. I wanted to press harder. I wanted to ask why there were two men in the trees where they'd come from, whether she knew them, whether she'd set this up as a dare. But the questions that needed answers required more than a single parking lot confrontation. High school is a place where you can be ruined by a sharp question that lands without proof. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she wasn't. The world settled into that infuriating grey. I remember standing there and feeling then the weight of 1,000 tiny decisions compress into one. Treatment or proof? I chose to go for help first. I found a teacher's number in my phone because of the stupid adult habit to stock numbers you might need. People moved from the fringes of the lot toward me. Someone offered a sweatshirt, someone else a bottle of water. A friend of Sienna's, who had been somewhere else on the trail and arrived breathless, ran up and held my wrist like you'd hold a sprained limb. Gentle, practical. I got to the clinic that afternoon, sat with my ankle elevated, let the nurse tape it up, and put a bandage on my lip. They said it was superficial, qualifying their kindness with an airy, "You'll be fine. When you are a teen, you'll be fine," is the kind of future the world hands you when it isn't willing to stop and look. What ate at me wasn't the physical hurt. It was the way Sienna watched everything like a director keeping an eye on her cast. Later that night, when I confronted her properly, harder, in a way that sounded like accusation because I was trying to lean into truth, she laughed at me. "Why would I set you up?" she asked. Her voice had that tilt that suggested innocence as a theatrical device. "I left to take a call. I thought you were behind me. Maybe you should pay more attention." The phrases people use to protect themselves from guilt are small and polished. She said, "Maybe you should pay more attention," like it was a kindly suggestion and not a way to wash off responsibility. Some friends took her side. Others stayed quiet, because that's what teenagers do when a truth isn't convenient. Rumors rippled. People like to make a story neat rather than messy. I heard names of people who might have been involved, theories about whether the two men were runaways, whether they were homeless, whether they'd been there to harass young couples. No one had proof. I had a second-hand account and a bleeding lip. The worst part, the part that has lasted, is the erosion of the simple mathematical logic of trust. When someone you thought was private and selective smiles and then leaves you to the woods, your internal ledger changes. You start to weigh the calculus of casual invitations differently. You wonder whether the person who suggests a left turn meant it as a suggestion at all. You replay conversations, trying to find the seam where a smile disguised something else. I broke it off with her not because I had ironclad proof, but because living with the doubt felt worse than living without her. I wanted to believe weird things could have happened without malice. I wanted some tidy explanation that put monsters outside of human skin. But every time I thought I could let it go, I'd catch myself listening for footsteps I couldn't see. I'd notice a car passing a second too quickly. I'd notice the way someone would stand at the edge of a group, just out of sight, and the place where a shadow had been that couldn't be explained. The aftermath was less about the physical. My ankle healed, the lip scar faded, and more about the ongoing rearrangement of trust. Friends told me to let it go. People said teenagers make storms out of nothing sometimes. Others suggested I had misread Sienna's aloofness as something more diabolical than it was. I know that. I know there are multiple possibilities and that the human mind is eager to stitch a pattern even where stitches aren't needed. But some facts settled like sediment. Sienna's car was in the lot when I ran out, and she didn't look worried until after I started shouting. 2 men had been there, and I had been their target, at least in part. Whether she had known them or not, or whether she had orchestrated it deliberately, are questions that live in the same limbo as the surveyor's old man and the Alaskan cabin, the area where facts and fear overlap. There are 3 explanations I cycle through, the same triad pattern that seems to be a survival mechanism for my head. 1. It's an enormous, terrible coincidence. People are lousy actors sometimes, and accidents happen. 2. She knew men who liked to hang out in the woods and left me because she wanted to be with them that day. Recklessness without premeditation. 3. The darkest, the one that tastes like metal when I let it into my mouth, that she set me up. That she'd practiced the posture of a casual leader, and then used the 2 men as the teeth of a plan she skirted me into. Each explanation is possible, and each hurts in a different way. Afterwards, I stopped taking hikes that weren't planned with at least 2 people I trusted. I didn't want to be alone in a place people could use against me. My friends noticed it too, the way I kept my head high at parties, the way I scanned edges when we walked to parked cars. My parents noticed the changes in small household ways. I came home earlier. I texted more often to say I was safe. I stopped answering calls when I couldn't be sure who was on the other end. The paranoia has not been helpful to my social life, but it was cheaper than pretending the fear wasn't there. A few months later, I saw Sienna down the hall in a tangle of lockers. She looked at me and smiled in that small way. I let her walk past. It felt like letting someone else keep a grudge you didn't have energy for. People asked if I wanted to press charges. The idea of walking through the legal mechanisms with a story that lacked hard proof felt impossible. Plus, teenagers are allowed to believe in resentment as a private property. I kept mine for a while. Sometimes memory plays the cruel joke of presenting evidence that never existed. I'd recall how she had pointed left, how the fork had been a micro-gesture of power. But memory is a dirty human thing. It curves to fit the state of your heart. I try to hold to the rule that saved me in other moments, the one procedural honesty that helps curb imagination's worst urges. I only assert what I saw and felt. I say, I think. I suspect. I don't know. Because those words are honest and keep me from making monsters where there might only be carelessness. The 3 stories you've heard, the surveyor in Idaho, the guide in Alaska, and me with Sienna, share a spine. A person goes into the trees expecting one thing and comes back with something else entirely. It's not the wind that always hurts. It's the way people can use the cover of the wild to hide decisions, to wait in the skin of the ordinary, and then, if they choose, to reveal a capacity for cruelty. The woods level certain things, but they also hide others. They amplify small choices into life-changing events, because there is no one else around to witness the before and after, only the person who lived it, and perhaps a few skeptical officials or friends. I replay the moments where I might have chosen differently, the step I could have refused, the day I could have said no, the times I assumed safety because a smile made me feel seen. There is a recurring thought that feels less like a memory and more like a tool. Isolation magnifies choice. Out there with no one to witness you, decisions become thresholds. You cross them, and sometimes you can't go back. Survivor's guilt isn't always about what you did wrong in a life or death decision. Often it's about the 1,000 tiny permissions that add up. Agreeing to a hike, trusting a grin, following a leader into a narrowed path. And yet, even as I say that, I refuse the hard cynicism that would tell you to never trust anyone in a faded jacket who laughs at your jokes. People can be ordinary and kind and complicated, the same way cups can be fragile and useful. The point of these stories isn't to turn you into something brittle. It's to remind you that the woods aren't neutral and people aren't either. They can be shelter and trap in the same breath. Those three voices, the surveyor who heard metal taps, the guide who found a cabin that may or may not have been a refuge, and the kid who lost trust in a smile, speak to the same nervous question. When you're alone among trees and footsteps begin to echo the shape of intention behind you, what do? Pack tighter, learn to expect malevolence, or keep moving, accepting that sometimes the cost of being alive is carrying a few more questions than answers. I don't have a single instruction, I have softer ones. Tell someone where you're going, take extra batteries, go with at least one trustworthy companion when you're about to swap pavement for forest. But mostly I have the insistence that you listen, the way a land surveyor listens to wind, the way the guide listens for smoke, the way a kid watches a friend's eyes for their real meaning. Listening won't guarantee safety, but it keeps you honest with the small judgments that can mean the difference between a story and a catastrophe. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the contour of certain sounds, the metallic tap that meant someone watched the surveyor, the thin, impossible scream under a cabin floor, the crunch of leaves that meant men stepped closer to me. They live in me, not as answers, but as questions. So here's one for you. The lights on the trail are going down, your breath fogs in the air, and the only sound you can hear is the soft pace of your own feet. Then, from behind, there are other steps. They match yours. They aren't part of your group because you came alone. You have a split second before you can either stop and turn or keep walking and see if the noise keeps. What do you do when the trees add a second heartbeat to your own? How do you decide whether that second beat belongs to wind, to coincidence, or to someone who meant you harm? If these stories give you that small cold shiver in the middle of your chest, tell me which one unnerved you most in the comments. If you've ever had a moment in the woods that changed the shape of the person you are, share it. These stories survive by being told. Like, subscribe if you want more true wilderness horror, and share this with someone who hikes alone. What would you do if you heard footsteps behind you and couldn't run?